Tim's going to be talking to us about the command line from the Linux perspective. Now, this is probably where I spend a good probably 6 to 12 hours of my day sometimes. So really excited for him to present this, but he brings us a great perspective from consulting as well as from working in the online gaming industry, specifically not like League of Legends, think more like online casinos, which you can imagine has some really interesting tech stacks. And he's worked from a background of help desk and technical support from into security. So I think that's important to note as well, because we talked about that as a pretty ideal means of entering into the security industry. So great stuff to show in here. I have had a sneak peek of your slides, so I'm looking forward to it. But without further delay, Tim, I will turn it over to you, sir, for my favoriteest title of the day, Heroes in a Bash Shell.
Thanks, Phil. Welcome, everyone. I'm hoping you're enjoying the summit and all the great presentations. We'll get through the initial slides fairly quickly, just so we can get onto the demo. So let's go. So I've been around IT for about 25 years. I did start in help desk. I worked for an ISP, so an internet service provider, way back in the mid-90s. So I was there when the internet was still very young and fresh, and grew my skills as a Unix system administrator, dealing with Solaris. Moved in, I think I started with my first Linux distribution back in '95, and have been a big fan of it ever since and seen it grow. As Phil said, I've been working in a number of different organizations around the world. And I'm very familiar with SANS and all the GX certs. I have quite a few of them. So I'd be happy to talk to anyone after about any of those if they have any questions. But let's get going. So human-computer interfaces. So way back in the 1940s, they started with punch cards. Thankfully, that predates my era. And the command line, which is where we're going to focus today, is still used very heavily, and it's one of my favorite interfaces to computers. It is like a language in and of itself, so it's really interesting that people who study languages like English and stuff like that do extremely well as system administrators when they start looking at the command line, because it's like its own grammar. Of course, there's still text-based menus which are used today. Most of people who are getting into computers and stuff like that are used to the graphical user interfaces, whether it's Windows or Mac OS. A web-based interface is still the same thing. We do have voice recognition now with Siri and Alexa and so on. And they've made extreme progress with Neuralinks. Now they have chimpanzees playing video games. So until we get to the point where we can actually think and the computer can do what we say, I still think the command line is by far the best interface to a computer. So why would you want to learn the command line? So the command line gives you a lot more control and freedom over what you're doing with your computer. You can actually get your computer to do things that others can't. When you're using a graphical application or something that someone else programmed, you're very limited. You're boxed into what they want you to do or what they think about the actual workflows. You can create your own workflows with command lines, which is really nice. The other thing that's really nice is that it's repeatable and consistent. So if I have a text file, and we'll go through some text files in a little bit, if I have a text file and I give a command to basically pull out information out of that text file, I can give you that text file and give you the same command, and you should be able to pull exactly the same information out. This is great because once you get repeatability, you can now start to program and automate things. Also, you can look at parallelizing your work. So if you know a number of steps have to happen on this text file, you can split it into multiple pieces, spread it across computers. Cluster computing is just something I'm starting to get into now. I have a nice little Pi cluster to work with. And the command line gives you a lot of flexibility with that, in that you can actually shift commands around and actually process them, and gives you a lot more capabilities than just a single computer. It also requires minimal resources. A graphical user environment is very heavy on a system. It actually takes up quite a bit of memory. Now, that has been reduced over time, but as new features the fancy transition effects and stuff like that happen, that takes up memory and that takes up programming space on the computer, programming or processing requirements. So with the command line, it's all text. It doesn't require all these fancy transition effects and so on. So you can actually get the computer to run much faster. And when you start looking at stuff like container technology and some of the cloud native stuff, it's all done via command line and building out the containers and stuff like that, right? It's not done in a graphical interface. Now, there are some weaknesses to it. There is a learning curve, right? The best thing to do for that is just get your hands on the keyboard and start working with it. The other thing that is, I would say, a little bit of a weakness is the computer is going to do exactly what you tell it to do, and there's no undo, right? If you haven't planned for an undo, and I've actually run across this in my past, creating a massive file to fail out a system only to realize that it was searched linearly and it killed performance. And I did it during a peak production. So learning from your own mistakes is pretty important. So today we're going to talk about Bash and the supporting cast. So Bash is the shell that gives us the interface into Linux and being able to send commands, but it's not alone in and of itself. It's got a supporting cast of a number of commands that were made available through the GNU project. And basically, there's over 300 unique software projects in that, and it's been around for a long, long time. GNU actually predates Linux, and Linux started in 1991. So the Born Again shell is actually a riff off of the original shell, which was called the Born shell. They added a lot of features and functionality to it. Even while it's open source, it doesn't mean that it's always been reviewed. There was a major vulnerability in the Bash shell in 2014 that was there since '89, which was shell shock. So as you get around security and start talking the language and stuff like that, you start talking about vulnerabilities. And this was a very big one. It affected a lot of major sites. And it was interesting that it had been in place since 1989, but only discovered in 2014. There were some other ones that came out this year with sudo and some others that also had been around in the code base for quite a long time. Okay, so this was a book that I read way back when I started my career. Actually quite costly now. It's close to $70, I think, on Amazon. But it actually talks about the Unix Velocity. And the Unix Velocity got transitioned into the Linux Velocity because the Linux kernel and programs were modeled after Unix. Now it's grown past that and has additional capabilities that your traditional Unix systems like Solaris, HPUX, AIX don't have. But these were the really key points of this book, right? So small is beautiful. So you want to have a program that does one thing and one thing well. By doing that, you know it's going to do exactly what it needs to do and nothing more. Couple that with the ability to actually put it into a pipeline so everything is a filter, which is the last one on here. You can actually chain these programs together. And I'll show you that as we go through the command line to show you that. They also said to avoid captive interfaces. So that's your web browsers, that's your desktop environments, because a captive interface is very difficult to automate and program. And everything is, they wanted everything as a text file because text is extremely portable. Now there is some issues with text when you start talking about character sets, right? Unicode and other languages, but text is actually a very universal format in that you can actually ship it around. You're not having to figure out where there's delimiters in the actual binary with coding and stuff like that. So let's get onto the demos and actually get some fun in here. Okay, so let me just switch over here to, okay, so here is our command prompt. Let me just actually increase that a little bit. Oh. Okay, so when I first started mentoring and teaching junior system administrators, I had a friend when I was in Silicon Valley. He wanted to go from project manager into Unix administration. And he goes, okay, so how do I learn to be a Unix administrator? I said, I want you to go through and look at every manual page on the system. And it took him 2 to 3 weeks. And he hated me for it. He hated me for it until I got a call about 3 years later saying that it was the best thing I ever did, because like learning how to read and learning how to read a book, eventually you learn what a table of contents is, you learn what an index is, so you actually learn how to find things in the actual, in the printed material. On a computer system, you have manuals. Now, back when I was helping him with that, it was the late 90s, and Google was around, but it wasn't anywhere near what it is now, and you didn't have Stack Overflow or Stack Exchange and stuff like that. So the manual pages, MAN for short, to get into them, tells you basically give you a help page on each of the commands that are there. So going through the man pages, there is a lot of commands. So if we actually look at the actual bin directory, right? Well, it scrolls off the screen, but let's count the number of commands that are in here, right? So there's approximately 1,358 commands, and that's just section 1 of the man pages. That's the commands that are there. There's other sections that deal with programming, the interfaces of Linux, and so on. And I had him read them all. Today, I would actually say you probably want to start with a much smaller subset, because this has grown over time. It's actually reading all the man pages was something I did early in my career. I used to do it once a year for the first couple of years on the Linux systems and Unix systems I was dealing with to make sure I understood what was there. But when you actually read a man page, right? So if I go and do a man of Seymour, it comes and broken down into very specific sections. So you got your synopsis, your description. You can zip through here. You can actually look at what your file that it's dealing with. And a lot of times it'll have other commands to see or examples. Now, if I don't know what a command is, and I say I want to find something about secure shell, right? There's another command called apropos, which basically will allow you to go and find all of your manual pages with regards to that search term. So as you can see, there's a lot of section 1. So the 1 in brackets is the section number. And then you have section 5, which is a configuration file. And then you have other things that are in there. So next up is, if I want to find out what something is, as well as I can also ask what is SSH, right? And it'll just give me that very specific if there's a command for it, right? So if I do what is again, right? It'll tell you the exact just for that one. There's another command set or help pages that is called info, but it typically requires a package to be installed, and it's not available on all Linuxes. The other thing that you can have is with a lot of commands. So let's do SSH. You can actually add in -- help, and it'll actually give you a mini help of what it expects, different arguments that a command will take. So if I want to do akka is a programming language that's on there, and there's no help option, right? There's sort. Another one we'll look at, right? It gives you a lot more information. So each of these programs are written by different authors and stuff like that. And a lot of these commands that I've typed in so far are all part of that GNU toolset, right? If you go to gnu.org, you can actually see it. They have terabytes of going back to different versions of those files. Okay, so we've gone through help. Help is a very important thing to learn. If you're learning PowerShell, Bash, whatever, going through and reading the help, reading the manual is definitely very, very helpful and important. A lot of things that people want to do on a Linux system is to find a file, right, or to find something that they're looking for. So there's a couple of different commands you can do with that. So we can locate, say, I want to locate, we can spell, Python 3. Right? That returns a lot of information. and it's not finding, it's finding Python 3, but it's finding Python 3 in all the different things. One of the more useful commands that we have is called grep, and that's global regular expression print, right? So, and it's been shortened down to grep, and it's used by a lot of people. And in this case, what I can do is I can actually look for 3, and then $ means that it's the end. It basically is looking for the last part of the actual string. So now I can just find the things that are with Python 3 at the end, right? If I want to be a little more specific, I'd actually do Python 3, and now I only find where Python 3 is ending, whether it's a directory or a file. Other commands that we can use is basically the find command. Now, the find command can take quite some time to master because it's extremely powerful. But I can actually do a find and look through all the files in this directory, and it'll actually go through subdirectories as well. If I want to find a binary that's in my search path, right? So if I want to see if a program exists on my system, I can actually do a which and look for an actual program. Now, this will actually go through, and if I look at my path, right, my path is basically all the different directories it'll search for programs. And in this case, the first path it found was in my home directory. But that's not the only place where top lives. I can actually do a where is and top, and it'll actually show me the man page for it, and it'll show me if it's actually in different paths. So this is extremely important from a security perspective. If someone actually puts something earlier in your path, it'll get run when you actually run the command, unless you actually use and specify the full path for it. So where is something that I use on a lot of systems to make sure that it actually is running the command I expect. Another thing that we can look at is ownerships, because once you actually can find files and stuff like that, you may or may not have access to them, right? File permissions is something that we deal with, whether it's Windows, Mac, or Linux. In Linux, basically you have discretionary access controls, which basically is broken down into basically 3 things, right? There's the user who owns something. There's a group which is associated with that object as well. And then there's also basically everyone else, right? It's very, very coarse as far as permissions goes, and that's the default, right? But it's not the only area where you can get into, because there are a couple other commands that we can actually use to get additional detail. So if I want to look at, you can actually put extended ACLs on systems and on directories and files. It's a command that a lot of people don't realize. So on a system, if you're running Docker or whatever, right? So if I try and run Docker, Docker's running on the system, I get access to that, because Docker does all of its permissions through the Docker socket, which is under var run, right? If I go to Docker sock, and if I do a get file ACL there, I can see that it basically has user and group and other. Now, you can also set file permissions to actually give me access to that. Now, a lot of people will actually add the individual into the group, and that basically will give you write access as well. But you can actually modify the ACL on here. So I can actually do modify user, my user, and then basically the permissions, docker.sock. All right. No, of course, I have to do that as privilege, because otherwise it would be bad. So I elevate my ownership into, and that's not going to work because I copied that over. So let's go bin. Okay, so now if I do get I can actually see that I have read writes in the Docker socket. So now if I do a Docker yes, I actually don't get an error message. I can do Docker images, and I can list it out. This is important because as an attacker, if you're not looking for ACLs and extended ACLs, if I've gotten on the box and I know that this is not something you're looking for, I can actually add permissions into different commands through the file ACL, and it'll go unnoticed by a lot of people. Now, adding in an account into the Etsy password for another super user account, or adding myself to a specific group might get noticed. This oftentimes will go unnoticed. We can actually then clear that out by just doing set file ACL, and we can actually remove all, basically remove everything that's extended ACLs on the actual software itself. Now again, I have to do sudo, and because, okay, so let's go back to, okay, so that gets us through some of those commands. The slides that I have will be available afterwards. Next up, we actually want to look at some files, right? So I downloaded a file from mock data. So I will put it up there. Should come up. Yeah, so Macaroon allows you to mock up data. So I do actually administer a number of websites for car enthusiasts for getting together and stuff like that. So these are not from those individuals. But if I actually look at so if I wanted to look at the file itself, I can do cat, which means concatenate, and it'll print it all out. Now there's 1983 entries in here. So I just want to look at the top 10. Okay. I can do the head, and that gives me the top 10 lines. Same as I can do tail, right? And that gives me the bottom 10 lines. Now, this is all text, and this is comma separated, which is something that a lot of people are used to. We get a lot of power with text files because we can actually use commands like cut, okay? And I know what the delimiter is a comma, right? And I can actually just print out fields. Let's say I want to do first name is the second field, followed by the third field, and fields 5 through 7 of, and let's just look at the first 10 lines of that, right? So in this case, I've actually removed filtered out stuff, right? So, and this gives us into seeing what the actual pipelines look like, right? So using things as filters, right? So we've gone from one command, push information to another command, which then filters and just gives us back specific information. We can actually change some things in here. Say we want to change, instead of, so comma delimiter is something that we've added in there, but let's say we want to use cuts normal delimiter. Cuts normal delimiter is a tab file. So we can use tr to actually translate one character into another. And like that, I shouldn't need that. And now, no. Okay. You know what? So now it's tab separated. I can now do cuts. I don't need to actually specify a delimiter anymore. So now I can do 2, right? So first and last names. Another thing is, we say we want to actually go through. Let's have a look at our data again. So now we can see that there's a large number of countries that we've added in here, right? So that is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So it's the 6th field. So we can actually do cut minus v comma field 6. Go to file. Right, so that gives us the number of countries. Now, what we can do is, if we want to count the number of people coming from each individual country, we can actually sort. Then we type it to unique minus C, and then we can actually sort by N. So, all right, so this is a very common use a series of filters. So the first one, what it does, it basically sorts everything alphanumerically, right? So lowercase a before lowercase b, and so on. Then we actually, when everything is sorted, the command unique will actually suppress repeating lines. So if you have a whole bunch of Canadas in a row and a whole bunch of Indias in a row, it'll actually suppress it. With the -C, it actually, instead of just suppressing it, it keeps count. So we can actually count how many. So in this file, there's 1,100 from the Philippines, 246 from Canada. You can do this with IP addresses. You can do this with other aspects. So if instead of looking at that data, let's say I go into logs and I go into my Apache, right, and I look at my access log, right. Well, this is not as pretty as what we've had in the past, but we can actually pull information out of here as well, right? Now, it looks like it's space delimited, but you're going to have additional spaces in here, right? One of the things that we can do is we can grep out our get and post. So grep by itself will actually look for standard strings. You can actually extend it by using a regular expression for your grep. So if you do a -E, you can add a standard regular expression, and I can look for post or get on log. Right? So this will highlight basically all of our gets and posts. Now, the GNU version of grep, which is not available on Windows and is not available on Mac OS unless you install it separately, allows you to actually use pro regular expressions, which is actually much better when you're actually looking for numbers, right? So say I wanted to find 3 numbers together, right, in the access log. So now it'll highlight the 3 numbers together, right? So I can actually look for specific things. The next thing that you can do is, well, we have the IPs in the beginning of the actual thing. So why don't we actually see how many IPs we have? So we can do, akka is another command that you would use on the command line, right? Akka is used when things are delimited by white space that is not consistent, right? So if I do, right, the white space is not consistent. There's one space here, one space here, but then there's multiple spaces here because you have different sizes. In this case, akka is preferred over cut, because if I do cut and I do a delimiter of space, right, and I do field 4, right, field 5, right, because of the additional space, basically cut believes it's another space. So what we can do is we can actually change that and actually have awk print it out. So that gives us the full numbers. Okay, so we've done sort unique. We can actually count the number of lines in a file. Access log, which gives us quite a bit. If we actually wanted to keep that information, right? Say we're actually filtering stuff in this log. So let's have a look at the log again, and say we wanted to grab out just the actual post, right, from the log. So we want to see all the posts that come out. So let's make sure we're actually doing it correctly. And so this is a common pattern with building up long command lines, is you build smaller bits and then you build on top of it. So in this case, I want to make sure I had all the posts correct. Now, as you can see in this one, it's not highlighting like it was in the past. If I want to do that, you can always add color equals always and actually get that. Now, let's say I wanted to actually look at all lines in context, right? I want to get all the posts, but I want to leave all the gets in there as well. Is what I can do, and this is a trick that I learned, is you can actually look and just look for nothing but the end of the line. So it'll match on every line. If I actually use grep, right? So now I get the gets in between the posts. This is very handy if you're trying to look in the context of where you're at in the file. You want to look at all the file, but highlight specific things. Let's go through, and so if I want to get all the information that's in that post and just the post information, right? There's another thing that you can do, which is just -O.
Yeah.
And what -O does is it'll pull whatever you're matching and just pull that out, right? So it just post doesn't make much sense, but when I start combining this with the regular expression, and say I want to grab IP addresses, so 1 to 3.
Hey, Tim.
Yep.
Hey, I just wanted to give you a heads up. I know you got a couple of more things to demo, and there's actually some questions in your hallway as well. I'm wondering if we may be able to kind of shift over to some of those more specific questions in the hallway, so we can bring Jen in and make sure that we're getting her the full time as well.
Okay, sure. Yeah, I can't bring up the hallway at the moment on the screens.
No worries. I just mean after we kind of shift over to Jen, I wanted to make sure people know that your hallway will still be open, and then you'll be able to answer the specific questions textually over there.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. As we're going through, yeah, because there's a lot of commands that I haven't covered. They're on the slides. So if I go back to slides, if I get on here, right? So there's a bunch of commands that like these are the important commands that I think you should learn. This one only, so the checkcon basically is for security enhanced Linux, which really only works on Red Hat type distributions that actually use it. Tail. So these are the primary commands if you're working with text files that you'd want to use. So getting familiar with these, right?
And just so everybody knows too, don't worry about like scrolling down these notes, immediately while this is screaming by, because you'll get all those slides available to you in your Summit Access page, and then you'll be able to check those out for reference as well, to make sure you can follow up on those. And the one thing that I would like to say too is, people are saying, how do I test this stuff? Well, setting up a virtual machine and something free like VirtualBox, great way to experiment with this, regardless of what your operating system is. But I'd spend so much time in the command line. I even learned a couple of things out of this, which was pretty cool, and I certainly appreciate that. So, well, thanks very much for sharing, Tim. Really, really good information. And I know that a lot of people kind of had some eye-opening, aha, head-exploding moments, which is always interesting to see as well, what you can actually get done without even stepping into the graphical environment. Really, really cool. Thank you very much.